do your presentation.
Sure.
Okay, let me give a brief introduction. As I said earlier, Mark does not really need any introduction to our group, but then again, we might have some new members, and give a little background. Mark Albertson is a historical research editor at the Army Aviation magazine and is a historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. Mark's a longtime member of the United States Naval Institute, and he's authored several books, one of which was the USS Connecticut, Constitution State Battleship. And my first introduction to Mark was when he presented to us a few years back. I want to say probably 6 or 7 years ago, on the USS Connecticut and its relationship with the Great White Fleet and Teddy Roosevelt and American foreign policy from that day forward. Mark is currently working on a number of other books, Sky Soldiers, the saga of Army Aviation. And then on the side, Mark teaches history at Norwalk Community College in Norwalk for the excellent extended studies program. And he also teaches for the Lifetime Learners Institute at Norwalk Community College. He teaches a number of courses there. And I got to say, Mark, if I had you as a history professor, I might have not gone into the field that I went into. So without further, Mark, the floor is yours. And thank you for coming with us today and sharing the story of the trial of the 20th century, Nuremberg.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. My wife says to me, you're giving a Zoom talk this morning, aren't you? I said, yeah, I am. She says, oh, I see we have a kitchen calendar, so I fill in where I'm going to be or what I'm doing and so on and so forth. She goes, oh, the Stanford Men's Association, you've been there before. I said, yeah, a number of times. She goes, why, a nice bunch of guys who want to sit there and listen to Mr. Sunshine for an hour. She says, I just don't get that. I said, why do you think bad news is on page 1 and good news is on page 9? So, but anyway, tomorrow actually is the official starting day 75 years ago of what we call the Nuremberg trials, or the beginning of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. It was a culmination of the end of the war. And as I get into this, I'm going to bring up one of the real shining stars of this episode of international jurisprudence, if that's what you want to call it. It's our own Justice Robert Jackson, who was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Another one was Sir Hartley Shawcross of England. And I'm going to mention too another judge who was there, Michael Musmano, who actually wrote a book on the Einsatz group and our action groups on the Eastern Front. But you know, to start with, I mean, this goes back to one of the premises for the war, and this is actually Adolf Hitler. He wrote this in Mein Kampf, and he said, "State boundaries are made by man and changed by man. We National Socialists must hold unflinchingly to our aim in foreign policy, namely to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled upon this earth." Now, that's Adolf Hitler. Another one that sticks out here is by Erwin Bauer. Maybe some of you have never heard of him, but this is what he says. And this is going to be one of the separate trials they're going to have at Nuremberg, the trials of the doctors. No one approves of the new sterilization laws more than I do, but I must repeat over and over again that they constitute only a beginning. Note that term, a beginning. Erwin Bauer, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biology. So it's interesting why you're going to have these trials. I mean, there's a variety of reasons here. But at 10 a.m. on the morning of November 20, 1945, 23 defendants file into the courtrooms. Now, some of these are the cream of Nazi gangsterdom, is really what they are. Of course, some of the bigwigs aren't here. Adolf Hitler, for one, committed suicide in the bunker. Joseph Goebbels is another. Again, he committed suicide in the bunker. Also, with his wife, they all took poison, and their 6 children and the family dog. Goebbels is the one who said after January 30, 1933, when Hitler was given the chancellorship, along the lines, we've made it, and the only way they're going to get us out of here is to carry our bodies out. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Heinrich Himmler was another one, the Lord of the Black Guard, the SS. Himmler was on the run for 3 weeks till he was captured by the British. And upon capture, they were going to interrogate him, but even though they searched him, they missed the L capsule that was in the back of his mouth, and he bit down on it and he died of cyanide. The doctors couldn't revive him. So those 3 will be noticeably absent. One who will be rostered at Nuremberg and will be sentenced to death in absentia was Martin Bormann. Now, to this day, no one's really sure what happened to Bormann. He was in the bunker, but he tried to make his escape. Some say he died in the ruins of Berlin. Some say he made it out of Berlin. But no one really has offered a definitive result on Bormann. So he still remains an enigma, but he was sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg. However, there are some who were going to be tried. Hermann Goering, or Fatso Goering, if you want to go that route. He showed up, or he was captured and brought to Nuremberg, hardly in that resplendent Luftwaffe uniform with all those medals. He was in shabby clothes. He was not the person he was. It was almost like he was emotionally broken. And he was arrested and brought to Nuremberg with 2 suitcases. They weren't filled with clothes. They were filled with, among other things, codeine and other drugs. Colonel Andrus, who was in charge of maintaining the prisoners' dock here at Nuremberg, said, he says, I thought we had captured a drug salesman. He had all this sort of paraphernalia in the 2 suitcases. Since he seemed to be a broken man, Colonel Andrus will take the time to refurbish him for the trials, to reestablish his obligations as a man to confront the trials. Now, I'm sure there must have been a judge or 2 or 3 who wished Andrus hadn't done that, because it's going to be Goering's intention of trying to organize all these defendants in a unified defense before the tribunal. It's not going to work. I'm sure you can probably picture the scene where many of these defendants are like rats on a sinking ship. They're going to try to weasel themselves out of the predicament they are caught in. However, the thing here is, how did you get to these trials in the first place? Well, by 1942, it was no longer a secret. There had been enough information smuggled out of occupied Europe that the Nazis were up to no good. Hostages, people being shot, the death camp, the concentration and the death camps. This is no longer a secret. And so countries such as, which had governments in exile in England, countries such as Norway, Belgium, Holland, Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Luxembourg, and even the French National Committee, all got together because they know there are crimes against humanity going on here, and so they all get together and they form a committee. And this committee is going to go into researching these war crimes. Even Franklin D. Roosevelt, president of the United States at the time, even in 1942 stated that at the end of the war, these criminals are going to face a comeuppance. Now, those are pretty tall words at a time you're not winning the war. This is early mid 42. We're not winning the war yet. But this is being formed. Also, what happens here is when these governments in exile form this committee to investigate war crimes, Britain and the United States, London and Washington come together, and they're going to join this group and really formalize this committee. And it's really one of the first big boosts for this organization that everyone's going to sign on to when the war is over with. It's called the United Nations. And this is where this is going to be known as the United Nations War Crimes Trials, the United Nations War Crimes Commission at this point. And in fact, you can go to Yale University. It's called the Avalon Project, the Lillian Goldman Library. They have a complete roster of the military tribunal at Nuremberg, the plans, how this was fashioned. And you can also go here too for many treaties, accords, agreements. For instance, they have the entire Versailles Treaty if you're interested in looking at that. Of course, if you want to read it, you're going to be there a week. But the fact of the matter is they have all of these accords, treaties, documents available for public viewing. It's quite a piece of work. I go there a lot. It's worth really even just taking a look at. But here by January 13, 1942, this attempt to formalize investigating war crimes will be called the St. James Declaration, which will be followed really by the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Now, not to be left out here are the Soviets. You know, Stalin is part of the Allies. And of course, I don't know if I gave that talk here or not on the Eastern Front, but it's the Soviets that are doing the majority of the fighting here against the German army, not America, not Britain, not a Free French. In fact, let's understand this. It's the Soviets that win the land war. We don't. They do. And they earned that right for Berlin. We did not. They did. They got invaded. They're the ones that are going to lose 25 million dead in 47 months. It was the most brutal area of the whole war. Stalin, though, having said that, Stalin wants to be a member of this commission. And so they're going to take a vote on whether they're going to have this commission. Now, it's interesting what Stalin wants to do. He wants each of the Soviet socialist republics to cast a vote separately. That would give Stalin 16 votes. You don't think these Union of Soviet Socialist Republics are going to go against Stalin, do you? He feels that if they can vote separately, he's going to command this. Well, guess what's going to happen here? London and Washington aren't going to subscribe to this. Picture if the United States decided to have 48 states vote separately. No, it's not going to work. But Stalin eventually acquiesces. But since he can't get his own way, he's going to create something here. And I find this interesting. It is called it's going to be called the Soviet Commission. It's an extraordinary state commission to investigate war crimes. Now, they're going to investigate the war crimes on the Eastern Front, and they're going to have a bushel to investigate. However, at the same time, Stalin wants it made known that when they're going to have, if and when they're going to have these trials, that the investigations are solely to be used against Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militarist Japan. Well, he's not stupid. You know, it came to light in 1942 that the Soviet NKVD, which is the forerunner of the KGB, had murdered 15,000 of the Polish intelligentsia. Officers, journalists, writers, teachers, you name it. They shot them all, buried them. The Nazis found them. And of course, the Nazis at first are blamed, but it was the Soviets who did this. Not that the Germans didn't do this, they did. So the Poles really take it on the chin here. And so they don't want to be put on trial either, but they want to take part in the trials. Well, Washington and London are going to go along with this because the Soviets are the ones doing the fighting in Europe, really, for the most part, on land. And so the style is going to be set here into 1943, into 1944, and by the end of 1944, that commission, the United Nations War Crimes Commission, has already assembled a roster of 2,000 criminals and mountains of evidence against them. early 1945, the Yalta Conference. This is the last time Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin will meet. Early February 45. And Roosevelt doesn't look good here now. I'm sure you've seen photos of Roosevelt at this point. He looks like he's on death's door, and really he was, because he dies April 12, 1945. But here at this conference, the discussion pops up. Well, what do we do about the German High Command? What do we do about the German Officer Corps? And it's acknowledged here that there are at least 50,000 officers in the German Officer Corps, you know, like from the rank of Captain Major on up. And Stalin says, why don't we just shoot them all? You know, and Roosevelt, making light of this, says, well, maybe we won't shoot all of them, we'll shoot 49,000. Churchill is in no mood for kidding here. He says to the two of them, I would rather be taken by the scruff of the neck out into the courtyard and shot for being party to such an iniquity. He knew Stalin wasn't kidding. He knew Stalin wasn't joking here. He'd have had all of them shot. Keep in mind, this is the same man, Joe Stalin, that during the purges in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, he had over 1 million shot and another 7 or 8 million sent to Siberia to make ice cakes. So Churchill was right. Stalin's not kidding here. However, as the final meetings are taking place for the war crimes trials themselves, because the war is winding down here, you know, Justice Robert Jackson comes to mind here. He was Truman's boy, because keep in mind Roosevelt's dead by April 1245. Justice Robert Jackson was an associate justice on the Supreme Court, big booster of rule of law. That's where he comes from. Gee, where is he when you need him today? And so he states, we need to have these trials. Now, the French right away say, well, how can we try individuals for war crimes? This really hasn't been done on this scale before. And Jackson's reply to the French is, well, now we're going to start. And he says, we cannot make the same mistake we made in 1918, 1919, when we held the entire German population to war guilt. He's convinced, and he's right, that eventually led to January 30, 1933, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. When you ostracize an entire population from the political structure of Europe, they are bound to feel ostracized. And so he says, no, we cannot judge the entire German nation, but we can judge the criminals from that population who perpetuated these crimes. The Soviets, you know, there were some Soviet negotiators still saying, well, we know they're guilty. Why don't we just hang them or shoot them? And Justice Robert Jackson again makes the case, no, we are the civilized end of this war. And you have to prove you're the civilized end of this war by engaging in rule of law. You know they're guilty, you try them regardless. And the reason you try them regardless is once you do not, you are going down the same road as the Nazis. He also brought up another point here, using the example of Sicily, where on Sicily there have been families who had vendettas against one another for generations. He says, picture how a giant Sicily, how Europe could be turned into a giant Sicily because of this war. He says, recall some Allied bomber crews, when their bombers were being shot down over Germany, German farmers, when they hit the ground, lynched them. We have to overcome this. So we're going to try these people. We're going to record the proceedings. We're going to collate the evidence and store it for the future generations. That's his notion. And he's backed up by many of the judges. Again, Sir Hartley Shawcross, Michael Musmano. This is going to fly. So now they're going to divide, now they're going to arrange the war crime trials. Keep in mind how this is going to work. What they consider major war criminals are going to be tried at Nuremberg. Those considered lesser war criminals will be tried in the nations in which they perpetuated their crimes. For instance, in the British zone of occupation in Germany, as a subsidiary to the actual Nuremberg trials, you are going to see before this is over. Keep in mind, this starts November 20, 1945. It's over by April 1949. But in the British zone alone, they will have 356 court proceedings to try 1,000 defendants. That's just in the British zone. And so now they're even reaching down to abusive concentration camp guards. I mean, periodically, if you remember, not that many years ago, you would get a blurb in the newspaper that so-and-so, who was reputed to have been a Nazi camp guard, perhaps in the Riga ghetto, had been arrested and was going to be sent back maybe to Lithuania or maybe to the Soviet Union to be tried, or whatever the case may be. I'm sure you remember blurbs like this happening. But in Nuremberg is where the major trials would be conducted. But in other countries where the crimes have been perpetuated, we'll call them minor trials, but they're subsidiaries to Nuremberg. And so on November 20, 1945 is when they start. Now, keep in mind here, in the handout, if you want it, and you can, I sent it to Joe, but also, by the way, you can also go to my website, Empire of Reason. There is a page there known as e-handouts. It's sitting right there. So you can download it, you can copy it, whatever you want to do. However, again, consulting with Yale University and the breakdown of the trials, it's going to be called the Nuremberg Military, the Charter of the, this is called the Charter of the International Military Tribunal. Part 1 explains the structure of the trials. But I'm going to concern myself with part 2, the jurisdiction. And I'm going to boil it down to Article 6, because we'll be here for almost a week here. Part A, crimes against peace, namely planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression, or war in violation of international agreements, or assurances, or participation in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishments of any of the foregoing. B, war crimes, namely violations of the laws and customs of war. Such violations shall include, but not be limited to, murder, ill treatment or deportation to slave labor, or other purpose of civilian population or populations of or in occupied territories, murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war, or persons on the seas, killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property. Well, that was certainly Hermann Goering. Wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, or devastation not justified by military necessity. And the last one here, crimes against humanity, namely murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population. And not only during the war, but before the war. This is what they're doing. They're going back before the war. And whether in connection of any of these crimes within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not in violation of domestic law in which the country was perpetuated here. Now, interesting here, when it goes back to killing of prisoners of war, that was done on a fairly liberal note, on a fairly liberal basis. Now, the Japanese too were responsible for this as well. If some of you remember the Bataan Death March, and the Bataan Death March was not the only one. There were a lot of death marches. But again, the Eastern Front, on June 22nd, 41, when Hitler threw 3.3 million German soldiers against the Soviet Union, they netted thousands of prisoners in the opening phases of this campaign. In fact, between June 22nd, 41 and March 1, 1942, when they had a lull on the Eastern Front, 4 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner by the Germans. 4 million. In that 9-month period, 2,500,000 are already dead. Add to that another 2 million battlefield dead. We haven't even gotten to the civilians yet, and that's 9 months. You know, if you go to the Navy Department, you find for this country, during World War II, 130,000 American military, people in uniform, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Army Air Corps, so on and so forth, have been taken prisoner, plus another 19,000 civilians. So approximately 150,000 Americans were taken prisoner. 4 million in 9 months? And this nation's going to win. Understand that. This nation's going to win. Fascinating here what's going on here with regards to the trial and also what went on here on the Eastern Front. But at the same time here, and I call this segment of the, and if you get the handout, you'll see this. I call this segment the trap. And I call this segment of the trap as far as the defendants are concerned, how these defenders are trapped here. On the night of June 30, July 1, 1934, Adolf Hitler purged the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers, if you will, led by Ernst Röhm. You know, this was a working class militia. That's what this was. And Ernst Röhm had 3 million beer hall brawlers, and yet the German army only had 100,000 men per the Versailles Treaty. So the army is concerned. We only have 100,000 men. Röhm's got 3 million men. You know, we don't like the math here. Big businessmen, big bankers are also concerned, and they tell Hitler, you want our continued support, you better tame Röhm. So on the night of June 30, July 1, 1934, and it's known in history as the Night of the Long Knives, 1,000 of the leading elements of the SA are shot. They're murdered. This led to the rise of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, because who you think did most of the murders? Heinrich Himmler and the SS. But Hitler calls in his marker. He did the big businessmen a favor. He did the big bankers a favor. He did the military the favor. Because on August 2nd, 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg dies. Within 2 days, mind you, Adolf Hitler takes the office of president. He's chancellor, puts them together. And what is he called now? Führer, the leader. And he also call in his marker, interesting what he does here, an oath of loyalty. The oath of loyalty to public officials. I swear I shall be loyal and obedient to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, respect the laws and fulfill my official duties conscientiously, so help me God. It's not just government officials. How about the military, the soldiers? I swear by God this sacred oath, I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German nation and people. Note this, the German nation and people. The Führer is Germany. Germany is the Führer. That's where we're going here. He is the supreme commander of the armed forces, and I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life anytime for this oath. They have now tied their fortunes to Adolf Hitler. And now when the war starts and they perpetuate all these crimes, guess what? You're going to get to the verdict by 1945. They got themselves in this mess, brother, and now many of them are going to pay. Hermann Goering, for instance, when he's sentenced on September 30, 1946, Goering, chief of the Luftwaffe, early member of the Nazi Party, close confidant to Hitler, one-time heir to be Führer, conspirator against legitimate government, the Weimar Republic, complicit in waging aggressive war. He was the founder, by the way, of the Gestapo, although Heinrich Himmler will later get control of it. Plunderer of the artworks of Europe, death by hanging. Goering is going to cheat the hangman because someone smuggled cyanide into his cell and he kills himself. Rudolf Hess, remember him? Early party member. He was also at one point Hitler's personal secretary and deputy Führer. Of course, Hitler makes him deputy Führer because the guy at some point really has sawdust for brains, so he's not a threat to Hitler. He is sentenced for life imprisonment. Keep in mind, he flew that Messerschmitt 110 to England, and when he went down, he was taken prisoner. So he's not a part of what goes on here in Europe after 41, but he will be sentenced to life in prison. He's sentenced to Spandau prison. He at one point becomes the last inmate in Spandau. And because he's 92, 93 years old, well, you know, London, Paris, and Washington say, well, why don't we just let him go at this point? Guess who says no? The Soviets. Let him rot there. And since he's 93 and he's the only inmate left there, they find him one day in his cell. He hung himself with an electrical cord. Hans Frank, murderous governor of occupied Poland, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, Minister Interior, death by hanging. Julius Streicher. Now here is a base-born, low-rent, bottom-feeding, belly-scraping degenerate. They don't get any worse than this. Even many of his fellow Nazis didn't want him in their company. How bad is that? He was that degenerate publisher of Der Stürmer, which made a regular habit here of putting Jews in the most pornographic situations as a way of degenerating the Jews. He will be hung too. Good riddance here, I guess. Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff, found guilty of waging aggressive war, death by hanging. And so will Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the high command. He'll be a prosecutor for waging aggressive war, death by hanging. Bormann, I mentioned before, death in absentia. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, the one that got together with the Soviets to carve up Poland in September 1939. He will be sentenced to death, and he will be hung as well. Do you know what he was doing before he was a foreign minister? He was a champagne salesman. You can't make this up. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, 1943 to 45, he was in the SS. He was an Austrian Nazi who joined the SS. He will be in charge of the Reich Ministry of Interior, the RSHA, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, party theorist, also at one point head of the political section of the Nazi Party and minister of the Eastern Territories, death by hanging. Karl Dönitz, remember him? Chief of the U-boat arm, got 10 years imprisonment. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Austrian Nazi politician. Later, he was the governor for Ostmark, which was the German term for Austria. He also will be named Reich Commissioner for Netherlands. He's the one that signed off on a lot of those orders deporting Jewish people in the Netherlands to the death camps, death by hanging. And so out of 23 defendants, 12 are sentenced to death. Bormann in absentia. Goering will commit suicide. So it's actually going to be 10 that will be hung, and they're all hung the same day, October 16, 1946. Now it's interesting here what happens with the bodies. The bodies will all be taken down, obviously, after being hung. They are going to be photographed with clothes on, without clothes on. And interesting here, the United States Surgeon General wanted all the brains exhumed and sent back to the United States for research. And the International Military Tribunal is going to say, no, you're not getting that. We've already done the psychological profiles before they were even tried, which they did. The bodies will be loaded into 2 trucks. This convoy is going to be heavily guarded. The bodies will be removed from Nuremberg and taken to Dachau, one of the concentration camps. The crematorium here is going to be fired up again. The bodies are going to be put into the crematorium and burned. The ashes will be collected. They will be put in the receptacles. They'll be loaded again onto a convoy and they'll be taken to Munich. They'll be dumped in the river. And that was the end of the original defendants of Nuremberg. But the trials will keep going here. For instance, an example of one of the trials outside of Nuremberg is the case of Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss was an SS officer. He is picked by, and he readily admits this, because he was on the run. He's captured by the British. he readily, signs a confession, signs what he did in the presence of his British captors. He admits that in March, April 1941, he was put in command of Auschwitz-Birkenau. He will be relieved of command finally at the end of December 1943. In that period, he readily admits he exterminated 2 million people in a little more than 2.5 years. He is sent to Nuremberg. The American authorities, after a quick interrogation, send him to Poland because that's where Auschwitz was located. He's going to be tried by the Poles. Well, this is not the free government of Poland. This is the Soviet-controlled government of Poland. So what do you think's going to happen to this guy? He hasn't got a snowball's chance in hell. He sits down in his cell and he writes his memoirs. And I have that book and I've read it several times. It's a interesting book to read. It's called Commandant at Auschwitz by Rudolf Höss. He will be sentenced to death and he will be hung. Another one is a man by the name of Otto Ohlendorf. And this is where Justice Michael Musmano really has to say here, because he wrote a book called the Einsatzgruppen, or the action groups in the East. The Einsatzgruppen were actually formed in 1938 after the Sudeten crisis, when Hitler was able to sliver off the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia and apply it to the German Reich. Of course, 6 months later, he helps disassemble the rest of Czechoslovakia. And here, the action groups, the Einsatzgruppen, in a fledgling form, were used to eliminate the intelligentsia of some of the intelligentsia of Czechoslovakia. They're doing the same thing the NKVD was doing to those Poles in the Katyn Wood. Of course, the group is enlarged for the invasion of Poland, and the Germans also eliminate some of the intelligentsia in Poland. However, this group will be on steroids on the Eastern Front. And as the major spearheads are moving through the Soviet Union, the action groups follow. There's 4 of them. Einsatzgruppen A, Einsatzgruppen B, followed by C and D, from north to south. Otto Ohlendorf is in command of Einsatzgruppen D. Now, this is a man who was an extremely intelligent individual, went to several universities, trained as a lawyer, extremely intelligent. Yet, what is he doing? He's exterminating Jewish people, as well as carrying out Hitler's order, the Commissar order, which Hitler ordered that besides exterminating the Jewish people, that every Communist Party commissar captured is to be shot. So there were pits full of them. And it's estimated by Justice Musmano that from June 22nd, 41 to about the middle of 1942, when they began to lay off from the Einsatzgruppen exterminating people, upwards of 1 million people had been shot on the Eastern Front. Of course, the death camps are taking control now, and the Einsatzgruppen were later retrained to be used as counterinsurgency troops because they wouldn't take guerrillas prisoner. But Otto Ohlendorf was brought before Nuremberg, and in a very perfunctory manner, he explained the process of the action groups as if it was really a 9-to-5 job. And that was the same attitude, it seemed, that Rudolf Höss had at Auschwitz. Fascinating, it truly is. Frighteningly so, but it's fascinating. Ohlendorf will be hung. The one that I think, which kind of irks me here, who will never be tried at Nuremberg, was Joachim Peiper. Joachim Peiper was a Waffen SS. That was the armed version of the SS. That was Hitler's political army. He was an officer in the 1st SS Panzergrenadier Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. He was moved from the Eastern Front, transferred to the Western Front. He leads the SS Spearhead during the Battle of the Bulge. I'm sure you recall the massacre of American soldiers at Malmedy. There was also another one at Stavelot, but at Stavelot, some Belgians were shot too, Belgian civilians. That's Piper. You know, we don't have time to take prisoners. We got to keep moving. So I shot them all. He's never tried at Nuremberg, but that doesn't mean he'll escape a comeuppance. He's living in France during the post-war era, and he lives in a little French village not far from the German border. Now, why to me he would live in France, I don't know. But he was in a little general store and he's buying some supplies and he paid for them and left. But the store owner, here's the man here, the store owner, thinks he recognizes him. And as soon as Piper leaves, he goes into the back room of the store, reaches up on the bookshelf, pulls out a book. It's a mug book. And he's opening up the book and he's going through the leaves of the pages. This guy was one of the French underground in World War II. He goes through the mug book. He finds them. Even though it's 35 years later, he makes them. Well, you know, he's going to call the boys. And several weeks later, Piper must have knew something was up because they found him on his front porch with a rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, and he had more holes in him than a screen door. This is precisely what Justice Robert Jackson wanted to avoid. But any system devised by man is not going to be perfect. People are going to slip through the net, and one of them was Piper. In this case, the French underground from World War II took care of him 35 years later, 1979. That's an amazing part of this thing known as the Nuremberg trials. You know, the idea was to make sure, going by what many Jewish people have said who lived through the Holocaust, we don't want this to happen again. Has it happened again? Well, what happened with the Hutus and the Tutsis in Africa? Remember that one? How about Pol Pot in Cambodia? How about what happened in Yugoslavia when, you know, in the Balkans when Yugoslavia fell apart? So it has happened again. Even in Sudan, it's happened. And so, but, you know, as I gave this talk the other night, and one fellow says, well, history is written by the victors. Isn't this the victors taking control? I said, yeah, it is. But then go back to what Justice Robert Jackson stated. Rule of law has to prevail. You know these people, and even more so if you know they're guilty. You're not degenerating into that, what the Nazis would have done, or even the Soviets. You're perpetuating rule of law here. You're trying them and then dispensing justice. But you collate the findings, you preserve the documents for the future generations. This isn't hard to figure out. This truly isn't hard to figure out. So it's an amazing story. Now I just scratched the surface, but it's a fascinating end of the conclusion of what we call the Second World War. Fascinating. Anybody have any questions or comments or observations? I mean, feel free to make them.
As previously, you know, like we did with the voting earlier, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself when you raise your hand so that we don't have to keep telling everybody to unmute. Okay, and I will call on you as your name shows up and then unmute you. And if you have another question, just raise your hand again. The first one, Joel Brest.
Question.
Good morning, Joel.
Good morning. Why was the trial held at a city, Nuremberg? Why not Berlin? Why not Dusseldorf? Why Nuremberg?
Because the Court of Justice at Nuremberg was still available. I mean, Berlin is a mess after what the United States 8th Army Air Force and the British Bomber Command did to it. I mean, they really focused on it towards the end of the war. But the Nuremberg, the international, the courtroom and the structure were available. Plus, they also saw Nuremberg as one of the major sites of Nazi gatherings besides Munich. And they thought by having trials here too, it would show what happens when you have a government such as the Nazis had, and an outside powers can come in and then take control and dispense justice in this manner. That was those are among the reasons they chose Nuremberg. But the Nuremberg hadn't been bombed to the extent perhaps as Berlin had. I mean, Berlin took a pummeling. Dusseldorf took a pummeling. Cologne, Hamburg. I don't have to go into Hamburg. That was bombed 76 times during the war. So Nuremberg was one of those cities that perhaps there were still some structures left to which to convene the trials. But it worked. It worked. You're welcome.
Arcady.
Good morning.
Yes, I have question for you, Mark.
Yes, sir.
There is a difference between long-term planning and short-term planning. When United States won World War II, there was a Marshall Plan employed, which helped to restore Germany economy. But when First World War I was over, the Versailles Treaty was signed, and one of the members of the British delegation, Keynes, who is famous economist, he said he resigned from this group committee because he said that this treaty will destroy German economy and there will be another war in 20 years from now. And he was exactly right. So what is your comment on the role of Versailles Treaty in World War II?
I give talks on the Versailles Treaty, and I think it's the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. And interesting here, Wilson came out with this, that this war was fought for democracy. Well, that was a lot of hogwash. That war was fought for money, colonies, politics, and power. The British and the French didn't want the Germans in that club of imperialist powers. End of discussion here. And that's what, and the United States is coming on as a great power. So now we're in that club already with regards to Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines. We're already in that club. And so you see here, if the British and French were that committed to democracy, they would have supported this fledgling system of representative government known as the Weimar Republic. And they didn't. What did they want, especially the French? They wanted the reparations. Well, how are the Germans supposed to pay 33 billion bucks when their economy shattered? Explain that to me. It's not going to happen. So again, the Germans feel ostracized. And on top of that, the Allies did not occupy Germany in 1918-19 as they will do in 1945. Things such as the German High Command, the General Staff was supposed to be dismembered. It never was. It will be in 45. And so in 1945, that comment is quite correct. And I mentioned it earlier, it will help to lead to the rise of Hitler. Why? Because Germans feel ostracized. Here's the man that's promising to bring the fatherland back. And exactly that's what he's going to do in a perverted form. I'll give you that. But at the same time, Justice Robert Jackson was correct. Roosevelt and them were correct. We need to have, especially Churchill, we need to have a bona fide Germany after the war to act as a buffer to the Soviet Union. And so Germany has what today? A democratic state. Why is that? Because it was occupied. You had the American, British, and French zones. The Soviet zone, well, what was going on there. But at least there was an attempt to try to fix the mistake of 1918-19. But I will offer you this. There really is no World War I or World War II. There's only one war. It starts in 1914, and the shooting doesn't stop in 1918. The shooting's over in 1922, and is jump-started again in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria, and it's over in 45. But what you're seeing here in the larger picture is the end of white Christian colonial dominance by the Europeans. Because by 1945, they can't wage industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war like two countries will be able to wage it. And that's the United States and the Soviet Union. They win the war in 1945. After Pearl Harbor, early 1942, it's the US and the Soviets that take control of this war. And when they take control of the war, the Europeans are done. It's over. Hence the Cold War. And Nuremberg fits into this. So to me, the Versailles Treaty, nice photo ops, but in the end, it didn't stop the continuation of the war. And that's quite correct. That's quite correct. So good question.
Mark, I have a question before I go to everybody else. The Nuremberg trials related to the German Nazis, were there equivalent criminal trials, war crime trials for the Italians and the Japanese?
Well, yeah, there were some Italians that were tried in Italy. Of course, you know what happened to Mussolini. Him and some of his followers and his mistress, not his wife, his mistress, Clara Petacci, were all shot and hung upside down in front of a Milan gas station. Although, you know who killed them? The Italian communists. That's who killed them. Japan, yes, you had a Nuremberg style trial in Japan. That kind of gets the short shrift here. But 7 major war criminals were hung. In fact, there's a how many here remember The World at War, narrated by Sir Laurence Olivier, that 26-week series, which is a very good series, by the way. And the first chapter on Japan, no, the second chapter on Japan shows 2 Japanese, an old man and an old lady. And this is 30 years after, almost 30 years after the war. They still went to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, commemorating the 7 dead. You know, the monsters, if you want to call them that, weren't forgotten by some of the Japanese people. And interesting too, is that in Tokyo, keep in mind, Japan, Joe, this is a big difference here. Germany is occupied by the Soviet Union, French, British, and Americans, not Japan. We are not going to repeat that in Japan. We will occupy Japan and cut out the Brits, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Dutch, the Chinese, everybody. We will, and the Soviets, we will do that. So the trials were somewhat different here. It was conducted by us and us solely, basically, and that was the end of it.
Thank you.
You're
Larry.
You didn't mention in the trials Eichmann. Was he also tried in absentia and sentenced in absentia? And how accurate was the movie Judgment in Nuremberg?
I'll take the last one first. The movie was fairly accurate. I mean, Stanley Kramer made the movie, so right there, you know, there's some quality to it. Stanley Kramer is also the one that got an Oscar for High Noon. You remember that movie? But
Yep.
Stanley Kramer was an excellent director. Yeah, there was a lot of. It was a well done movie, you know, with regards to, of course, if you remember, Spencer Tracy is a judge who's trying one of the so-called lesser criminals. But the story is well done, especially when you get to a character that was portrayed by Montgomery Clift,
Yes.
the mentally challenged individual who was sterilized. That's true. So they did bring up something that was true here. There were people who were sterilized who were brought up to give evidence during the doctor's trials. That movie was fairly accurate. It's a long movie, but it's accurate. With regards to Eichmann, yeah, he'll be sentenced in absentia, but you know what happens to him in the end? The
Right.
Israeli Secret Service got him in South America, brought him back for trial. And I remember as a kid seeing him in that glass enclosure
Yep.
in the courtroom. Of course, eventually what happens to him? Like Piper, only that was in a courtroom setting, but he got his comeuppance. But interesting here too, you bring up Eichmann. was Joseph Mengele. Remember him?
Yep.
Yeah, he was supposed to be taken the same time Eichmann was. But someone tipped him off and he was out the back door before the Israeli Secret Service arrived. They'll never take him prisoner, but he did die later in South America. So Eichmann is an example of some of these trials that happened to escape Nazis long after 45 to 49, long after that.
But was he tried in absentia and sentenced in absentia at Nuremberg?
Yeah, he was. But, you know, they had yet to capture him yet. You know, but again, another one was Bormann, but nobody ever found him. Eichmann, they did. Eichmann, they did. And Eichmann knew he was going to get his after what he did, you know. So, interesting.
Carl
Interesting.
Shapiro.
Mark, the question I have for you
Yeah, good
relates to Judge Jackson, Robert Jackson. He took a leave of absence from the Supreme Court. Now, how did they handle the Supreme Court when in his absence?
You know, I didn't get into that end of this, but that's a great question. That's a good research question. I didn't get into that. Although I would assume, you know, considering we're you know, you're getting the aftermath of the war, the Supreme Court functioned all right. But I honestly don't know.
Have you ever been to his center he has his own, there's a center up in Jamestown, New York. Have you ever been there for your research or anything like that?
No. Some of this research I did to the Holocaust Museum, and I can look over here and I got a whole bunch of books on the Nuremberg trials and the SS and the Holocaust, and also on the T4 program, which I didn't mention at all. The T4 program was the blueprint for the final solution. The T4 program was that program of organized medical killing, where the Germans advanced themselves from sterilization to actually ridding the Reich of those who were considered incurably physically handicapped, mental defectives, as the term was used. And they began that project from fetus to age 3. Then they broadened it to age 16. Then Hitler ordered it up to the adult population. And during this period, they're really not, at the first part of this, they're not picking on Jewish people, Slavs, or Gypsies. They're actually putting German Christians to death here. First with the syringe, then with little gas chambers. And then obviously, you know what's going to happen here. After they stop the program, the SS takes over and it becomes the final solution. And some of the doctors here, like Dr. Hermann Fanmuller, who was a psychiatrist who condemned a lot of people who were mental defectives, if you will, incurably handicapped to go to the syringe or the gas chamber. Many of these doctors will plead their case at Nuremberg, saying, well, we started our case, the sterilization laws, based on what the United States was doing earlier in the century. In fact, before 1910, a number of states in this country were sterilizing people who were incurably physically handicapped, people who were considered mental defectives, people who were criminals. And Connecticut was one of the first states in the Union to do that. Connecticut, California, Illinois, Indiana, Virginia. And so their defense was, look what the United States was doing. It's not going to help them. They're going to get convicted anyway. So it's interesting where this, you know, what really happens here truly is.
Franco.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I'm concerned in one question very important, the question of the link between power and legislative. Seems to be Hitler was able to nominate his illegal people in the highest court. I am really concerned about the element of people in power have the tendency to nominate their own judge, and so when they are guilty would be saved. Worry me now the situation we are assisting in a modern time in this country, where the people in power nominating people in the legal system that they hope we will save them later on. Any comment on this?
Well, yeah, you can go back to the Soviet Union and you know, Stalin with his personal judges here, you know, putting on trial members of the Bolshevik party he came up with during the 1930s and purged the party. You know, those show trials he had. Hitler did the same thing after the July 20, 1944 plot. If you remember, they tried to kill him. And the plot didn't work. And 5,000 people involved in or associated with that plot were either hung or shot. Many of them were hung on piano wire, and Hitler had it filmed and he watched it. So this is a perversion of justice, to be sure. But dictators will do this. They will apply a favored judge to dispense justice. I mean, to give you an example of how the potential of this in Germany worked, keep in mind you had a Weimar Republic in Germany. And I'm going into the early 20s here. Many of those elected to the Reichstag were from the Social Democrats, the Catholic Center Party, the Democratic Party. They're not right. They're either center or center left. Yet, the government functionaries who were still in office had been appointed by the German General Staff when it became a dictatorship after August 29, 1916, or had been applied when the Kaiser was in power. Now, neither of these regimes are democratic style regimes. So how do you think these government functionaries see things as opposed to the elected officials put in by the people? I'll give you an example here too, because between 1918, 1922 in Germany, there were 356 political murders. 376. 354 had been done by the right. And yet 64 people will be arrested or tried. 11 will be shot or hung. All 11 that were hung were from the left. Now you got a problem here. You got a problem here. If you got elected officials who can't stop what the government functionaries are doing, you think you have a functioning system of representative government here? I don't think so. I don't think, and this is by 1922. It's fascinating. Truly is. Truly is. So what you're saying, Franco, is the pattern's already set here in Germany, even during the Weimar Republic. Interesting. You know, you take the long view here, you see that leader of this movie you're running up to. That's what history shows us here. And I don't think we do that too well in this country. You have to look at that leader before you get to the event, the movie. There is a leader to this. And I don't think, and as I said, I don't think we do that too well in this country. I don't think we do that this well at all. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sheldon.
Thank you.
Mark, you had mentioned that the Nuremberg trials, one of the purposes was to document what had gone on during the war.
Right.
So that people would have the evidence necessary to refute anything that was said if it was not true. Now, there's a lot of what's called Holocaust denial going on today.
Yeah, yeah.
That's grandson.
Do you know how that's being handled by the Nuremberg people, or?
Well, the organizations like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. tries to handle that. The Southern Poverty Law Center tries to handle that. But, you know, this seems to be part of the human condition. You know, you get to 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. That's ancient history. Gee, did it even happen at all? I mean, how many people will question whether you really had a Jesus Christ or not? You know, you're always going to get the naysayers.
It's into is really the anti-Semitic sense, not, oh, that probably didn't happen, but it's against the Jewish people.
Right.
So it's up to date.
Well, that's something to be said too. That's something to be said too. And yet, I know Jewish people who were in the camps. All you got to do is see the number tattooed on them. That's all you got to do. And of course, that group is getting sparser and sparser and sparser. That's unfortunate, but that's the passage of time. Like many of the World War II vets are dying out now too. That's unfortunate too. But Sheldon, I got a chance one time about 30, God, it's 35 years ago already. Holy mackerel. I used to go to the gun shows because I used to find a lot of history books that were out of print at the gun shows. And this friend of mine used to buy and sell uniforms. And he was very good at, Kevin was good at it. Well, he introduced me to this guy called Joseph Yakas. The guy was Lithuanian. And he was on his father's farm. He was 17, 18 then, when the Soviets marched in 1940. Some of his cousins, some of his uncles were thrown on the boxcars and sent east as slave laborers. The Nazis came in June 22nd, 41, and they were seen as liberators. And, they were glad the Germans came. Stalin's out. However, when the fortunes turned against the Germans, since Mr. Yakas here was Lithuanian, but of German descent, he joined the 15th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, which many of whom were Latvians of German descent, and he fought on the Russian front as an SS man. And he could never go back to the Soviet Union. What would have happened to him if he went back. And when I met him, he's an interesting guy to get to know. I looked at it from a perspective, from his history, that here's a guy that fought on the Eastern Front. I don't see very many of this. And he told me in his broken English, if possible, to put on old uniform and go and put together old outfit, go back to Russia, kill every man, woman, Russian child, Russians no good. That hate has lasted 40 years. Now, the Nuremberg trials didn't stop that, unfortunately. But it gives you an idea how some people felt or still felt when the war is over. How do you judge the human condition?
Well, you had mentioned that they didn't want to have people just hunting down the Germans after the war.
Correct.
And at the Battle of the Bulge, for the first time, they singled out, I'm on to the Jewish element again, they singled out Jewish soldiers and they put them in work camps. And after the war was over, a lot of these soldiers went out to find their captors and to kill them. Right.
Well, my father-in-law, his brother, he was from, and his brother lived in Stanford. I don't know if any of you knew him, Lenny Pagliano. That was my father-in-law's brother. And Lenny was in the Battle of the Bulge. And Lenny told me, he says, when we found out what some of the SS did to American soldiers at Malmedy, he said, German soldiers, German army, we took prisoner. Some of the SS were shot by American soldiers. And so, people are people no matter where you are. And so could American soldiers be put on trial for that? Technically, yeah. But who's going to do that? But then again, who started it? Now here we go back to that side of the argument. Who started it? Well, they did it to us, so we're going to do it to them. But in fact, to give you a point that's even more crass, interesting here in the Pacific, when Eddie Rickenbacker was touring the bases in the Pacific, and he was on his way back to Pearl Harbor, and the plane went down in the Pacific, and the Navy picked them up. And when he went to Pearl Harbor on his way home, you go through the break bulk point. They go through your luggage, and if you're not carrying any Japanese pistols, knives, swords, so on and so forth. And the sailor going through his luggage says, "Where's your sock?" "What do you mean, where's my sock? I'm wearing them." No. The sock in your bag. "Well, they're right here." No. And I don't understand what you're talking about. And the sailor explained to him that some of these GIs and Marines who would have been on those islands fighting the Japanese used to take their Bowie knives and cut out the gold and silver fillings from the dead Japs' teeth, put them in a sock and bring them home. We're going to cash them in. And Rickenbacker had no clue of this. He's shocked. So could those Americans be tried for mutilating bodies? Well, who's going to do that? But does that show you what happens in this environment? Yeah, it darn well does, sure, doesn't it? So nobody is squeaky clean here. I mean, let's establish that. How many are really squeaky clean here? So,
John Bullock, last question.
yes, sir. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Great presentation, Mark.
Thank you.
Kind of a related subject. We all know about the rocket scientists that were absorbed by the United States and the Soviets.
Yeah, like Werner von Braun.
Yeah, were there any other groups that were exempt from Nuremberg because of special talents or circumstances?
Yeah, there's a fellow I work with up in Army Aviation Magazine who does the advertising for us. But Bob's a historian too. And he knew a guy who was captured after the war. He was SS and he got captured by the Americans. And he was in a prison camp. You know, he's getting ready to be processed. And they do a background check on you if it's possible. And all of a sudden they came out and here he is. I mean, he's on Tobacco Road here. He has nothing at this point. And they tap him on the shoulder and they take him into the office and they virtually tell him, have we got a job for you? Seems like before he was in the SS, before the war, he was working on the German helicopter program. So they brought him back to the United States and guess where he's going to wind up working for 35 years?
Sikorsky?
Right. He worked for Sikorsky for 35 years, earned his retirement, and finished his life out in Florida. In the Pacific, Unit 731, I don't know how many of you have heard of that. It was run by a Colonel Ichiki, and there were doctors here experimenting on prisoners, testing new surgical instruments, infecting them with smallpox, brucellosis, you name it. They, and most of them were Chinese or Korean. Some were British, Australian, New Zealanders. Some were Dutch, some of those captured on the Dutch East Indies, and a few Americans. And the United States, when the war is over with, wanted those records. Guess what's going to happen here? All these guys are going to skip. Ichiki will never see a courtroom. And all those Japanese doctors that did these experiments are going to wind up in the post-war Japan with a thriving private practice and or working in some of Japan's leading hospitals. We'll never see a court.
Oh.
So people are what they are. We want those records. Well, what can you do for me? And these guys skipped. And I saw an interview with one of these Americans who was experimented on. And he wasn't the only one. They got lawyers and they approached the United States government. We want recompense. And guess what happened to them? Nothing.
Nothing.
And this guy said on Channel 13, this goes back about 15 years ago. He said, my government sold me down the river. Yeah.
Mark,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you for another great presentation. And hope that you'll be willing to come back again. And when you come up with a couple of different presentations that we haven't heard, and I know there are a few. So look forward to the next time you're with us again.
Actually,
As
thank you.
always.
Actually,
Thank you.
I've had some places here, especially assisted living facilities, because I'm still giving talks with those people, although most of this is Zoom. They wanted lighter topics, something a bit more uplifting than what was talked about today. And so I started giving talks, and this has gone over on Laurel and Hardy, Jackie Gleason. It is a different tack to take. The Marx Brothers, I started giving, because I grew up with this as a kid, and I love Laurel and Hardy. So doing Laurel and Hardy is no stretch. But it's gone over, and I've had a lot of people, especially Laurel and Hardy and Jackie Gleason. And there's only one Jackie Gleason.
Oh,
He's a fantastic topic. He truly is.
About
One
the
of a
Three
kind.
Stooges. How about the Three Stooges, Mark?
Oh yeah, another group. Oh yeah. Yeah, they were fun, especially when Curly was with them.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's when they were at the and W.C. Fields. It's another one.
Abbott and Costello, Sid Caesar, and
All right, we could go for you can go forever here. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
you got an untapped world of.
Yeah.
I mean,
Laurel and Hardy and Jackie Gleason. In fact, Laurel and Hardy, I brought up the fact that when they were first put together in 1927 as a team, they did a movie called The Battle of the Century. It's about 22, 23 minutes. And this movie was lost for decades, but it was found. And it's considered by the Academy to be be an American treasure. It's 22, 23 minutes, and it's recorded as history's greatest pie fight. It lasts almost it takes up almost an entire city block. And Hal Roach used up 3,000 cream pies. It's hysterical to watch. I mean, it really is. It's hysterical. And people like to hear about this stuff.
Okay, Stu Madison is going to be taking over the scheduling of programs from me. So, Stu, you've heard that, and
I'm taking notes.
taking notes.
I'll give you one more short story. Jackie Gleason, when he was on the Johnny Carson show, Johnny Carson said, well, you were good friends with Toots Shor. Remember Toots Shor's restaurant in New York? Well, that wasn't a restaurant. It was a saloon. That's what Toots said it was. And Jackie Gleason, early in his career, Toots Shor must have took a shine to him. And he says, well, when you come in, you can sign, because Johnny Carson said Toots told me that you used to go into his saloon and you would order drinks and you signed for him even when you didn't have the money. And Jackie Gleason goes, that's right. He says, I went in there and he told me, he says, hey kid, you want anything? Sign for it. So he said this one night, it must have been like 1950. How much do drinks cost in 1950?
Oh, nothing.
Jackie Gleason said, I ran up a bill of $60. And he said, I added a $40 tip. And he says, Toots comes flying out of his office. What are you doing? And Jackie Gleason goes, keep it up and I'll give you back your pen. A great one.
Oh, yeah. And he had that little slouch from Yonkers. What was his name? Art Carney.
Oh, yeah.
I think Art Carney put him over the top.
Oh, yeah. Audrey Meadows. Yeah, it was a great group.
So, okay, again, Mark, thank you so much for presenting to us. And we really enjoy when you speak to us. So
thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Anytime.
Oh,
Just give me a call or email me.
Okay.
Have yourselves a great holiday.
You too.
Bye.
And stay well.
Thank you.
Take care now.
Okay, guys, thank you for being with us, and see you in 2 weeks. Stay safe, stay well, stay healthy, and enjoy.
Long, Joe.
Bye. Bye.